Hello. It is time for another chapter in Church History in Plain Language by Bruce Shelley. I recommend this book to anyone who does not own it. It's very good. Okay, so the next section is Chapter 31, The Rule of the Saints, Puritanism. In 1630, more than 400 immigrants gathered at Southampton, England, preparing to sail to the New World. John Cotton, a distinguished minister who later joined them on the other side of the sea, preached a farewell sermon. His text for the occasion summed up the spirit of the great adventure. He took it from 2 Samuel 7:10. And I will provide a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore, as they did at the beginning. Cotton declared that, like the ancient Israelites, these immigrants were God's chosen people, headed for the land he had promised and prepared. In this new land, they would be able to labor undisturbed for the glory of God. There you have a snapshot of Puritanism, the Bible, the covenant people of God, and their divine mission in the world. While it endured as a distinct historic movement between 1560 and 1660, 100 years, Puritanism provided for the Christians of every generation a model of the Christian faith as a decisive commitment to Jesus Christ and how that life of the soul expresses itself in the public arena, in a nation governed by the truths of the Bible. Next section, Puritanism, New Life, and New World. In more recent centuries, Christians have renewed from time to time the Puritan experience of the soul, a type of piety arising from the purely gracious work of God in the heart of the believer. But no later Christian movement has had the vision or the opportunity to apply the law of God to the life of a nation. In these modern times marked by zeal for individual rights and sexual freedom, Puritan has come to refer to a person who is self-righteous, hyper-religious, or sexually repressed. One who does his best to keep people from having fun. This view of the Puritan as a moss-backed moralist captured popular thinking in the backlash against Victorian stuffiness. Early in the 20th century, American journalist H.L. Mencken summed up the popular image in his quip that Puritanism was the haunting, quote, this is a quotation, the haunting fear that someone somewhere may be happy, unquote. That's actually funny. But is that fair? What was Puritanism originally? Whatever it was not stiff or straight-laced. It stood for change in a new day in England. The first Puritans had little confidence in traditional religion. Their plans for a new England arose from a deep conviction that spiritual conversion was crucial to Christianity. This rebirth separated Puritans from the mass of humanity, even other Christians who had not been so reborn, and endowed them with the privileges and duties of the elect of God. The church may prepare a person for this experience, and after it the church may guide him, but the heart of the experience, the reception of the grace of God, is beyond the church's control. In its quest to reshape England, the Puritan movement passed through three rather clearly marked periods. First, under Queen Elizabeth, 1558 to 1603, it tried to purify the Church of England along the lines of Calvin's Geneva. Second, under James I and Charles I, 1603 to 1642, it resisted the claims of the monarchy and suffered under royal pressures designed to force conformity to a high church style of Christianity. Third, during England's Civil War and Oliver Cromwell's rule, 1642 to 1660, Puritans had a chance to shape the national church in England, but failed because of their internal dissensions. Such an outline suggests, as it should, that Puritanism had a public side as well as a personal side. It began with an individual's experience of the redeeming grace of God, but moved on to stress the mission of the elect in the world, the shaping of society according to biblical principles. In its emphasis on the interior life of the saint, Puritanism was a taproot of later evangelical Christianity with its born-again message. In its stress on a disciplined nation under God and his laws, it contributed significantly to the national character of the American people. Puritanism, England's second Reformation, first appeared during the reign of Elizabeth. It had a new style of preaching, a message aimed not at the head but at the heart. This spiritual brotherhood, as William Haller, a Puritan authority, once called it, included names like Greenham, Rogers, Chatterton, and Dodd. Many of these first Puritans had been Protestant exiles of the reign of Bloody Mary, 1553 to 1557. Hounded out of their homeland by their Catholic queen, these Protestant sympathizers had gone to Geneva and mobilized as a vanguard for a fresh Calvinist assault on England. The military image is appropriate, for in the late 1550s, Geneva had become a center for international subversion, sending out cadres of students inflamed with a passion to overthrow Catholicism in their homelands. In 1560, John Knox was successful in Scotland, and the English reformers hoped for as much in their own country. Queen Mary's death and the crowning of Elizabeth appeared to be an invitation to the exiles to return to England. They took up their work, still convinced that the Bible gave specific guidance for the ordering of personal life, the structuring of the church, and the regulation of society. They discovered that the most explosive political issue was the authority to choose ministers for the churches. Puritans wanted the selection of their ministers to rest with the people. The Queen insisted that the appointment of bishops was a responsibility of rulers. As long as Elizabeth lived, she allowed these Puritan dogs to bark so long as they did not bite. The Queen's tolerant policy permitted them to complain about prayers from a book and special clothing for ministers and the sign of the cross during baptisms. Just about any practice that looked like Roman Catholicism, but she would not hear of their control of the church. She allowed them to lecture for hours on the importance of preaching and the biblical office of elder, but she made sure the Church of England remained firmly in the hands of bishops and therefore in the control of the crown. Next section, a people of the book. The Puritans' zeal to purify the Church of England was fired by eager reading of popular versions of the Bible. Chief among these was the Geneva Bible. The name came from the fact that it was the work of several of those English exiles in Geneva during the reign of Catholic Mary. Miles Coverdale, who had translated the first complete Bible into English in 1535, was in this group. Once printed during the early years of Elizabeth's reign, the Geneva Bible's numbered verses, lucid prose, improved scholarship, extensive prologues, and marginal notes gave it wide popularity, until its eventual replacement by the King James Version, which was in 1611. It was the most widely distributed Bible in English, and was the one the Puritans carried to America. The Puritans, however, had more than their Geneva Bibles. They had a sense of destiny, a vision of God's purpose among individual nations. The idea that the Almighty moves in the affairs of people is traceable, to be sure, to the Bible, but the concept of the pilgrimage of God's faithful people spanned the centuries and led at last to England. Let me read that part. But the concept that the pilgrimage of God's faithful people spanned the centuries and led at last to England was from another book. John Foxe, in his highly popular Book of Martyrs, planted this idea in the minds of English believers. Like the Geneva Bible, the Book of Martyrs was a product of the English exile during the reign of Bloody Mary. Foxe marshaled account after account of the suffering of faithful Protestants who dared to die, if need be, for the triumph of God's kingdom. According to Foxe, this trail of martyrs led to the shores of England and to the reign of Mary. The conclusion seemed clear. God had a special place for the English people in his worldwide plan of redemption. The influence of the Book of Martyrs proved enormous. Generation after generation of English people saw history and read their Bibles through Foxe's eyes. Aside from the Bible, his book probably did more to shape the mind of the English than any other single volume. Less than half a century after Foxe's death, Puritans carried his work and his philosophy of history, along with their English Bibles, across the Atlantic into the American wilderness. And here we have a picture. It says, title page from the 1569 edition of the Geneva Bible. Here it is. And now, thanks to their study of the Bible and their reading of the Book of Martyrs, Puritans came to think of themselves as God's new Israel. Most Christians in the 17th century believed that the Bible was God's inspired word and revealed will. The key to the Puritan view of the Bible and of themselves lay in their understanding of that fundamental biblical concept called covenant. The Puritans, like the ancient Hebrews, believed that spiritual contracts existed between God and men. The most important was the covenant of grace. This was the spiritual contract by which true Christians were bound to God. While they believed that God sovereignly elected individuals to salvation, they also held that anyone, by personal faith in Jesus Christ, could be added to the covenanted company. By grace, believers became God's people, and He their God. This near bond obligated the saint to walk in all God's ways made known in his word. On the other hand, it opened the scriptures as a deeply felt source of spiritual and emotional strength, a fountain of that rugged determination for which the Puritans became famous. To live within the covenant of grace was to live within the light of the word and according to the plan of God, of Almighty God. Okay, conflicts with the king. Next section. In 1603, the long reign of Queen Elizabeth came to a close when she died without an heir. James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary Queen of Scots, became James I of England, uniting for the first time the two kingdoms. Any Puritan hopes for James's bringing Presbyterianism from Scotland to England were dashed early. He welcomed the chance to deal with bishops. Rule in Scotland had been a constant struggle with Presbyterian ministers. A Scottish presbytery, he said, agrees with monarchy as well as God and the devil. In other words, they don't agree. At the Hampton Court Conference in 1604, some leading Puritans had a chance to present to the king their ideas for change in the Church of England. But James, who had an inflated view of his own intelligence, dismissed most of their opinions rather rudely. On only one point did he consent to the demands of the Puritans. He was willing to commission a new translation of the Scriptures and name it after himself. From this decision came what we call the King James Version of the Bible. On nothing else of significance would the king yield to the Puritans. The ceremonies, the prayer book, and the bishops of the Church of England were going to stay. And if the Puritans did not like it, they would still submit, or, said the king, I will drive them out of this land, or else worse. With that threat, the conference broke up. James's initial contact with Parliament was equally tactless. In his first address to the body, he defended the divine right of kings. This is a quotation. The state of monarchy, end quote, he said, continue quote, is the supremest thing upon earth, for kings are not only God's lieutenants upon the earth and set upon God's throne, but even by God himself they are called gods. Wow. End quote. Sweeping aside English institutions and ignoring the mood of the English people, James made it plain that he meant to be an absolute monarch. In 1611, he dissolved Parliament and for the next 10 years ruled English without it. Thus, the leaders of the Puritans and the advocates of parliamentary authority in England tended to merge in their resistance to royal power. Some of the Puritan movement, however, grew impatient for change in the church. Shortly after the Hampton Court Conference, little groups of believers began to meet for worship as they felt the Bible taught them, not according to bishops and prayer books. They were determined to obey God even if their nation's leaders were not. We call this movement separatism because the groups were intent on separating from the Church of England. One of these groups was in the village of Scrooby in northern England. Another was not far away in Gainsborough. By 1608, both congregations had moved to Holland for safety and freedom of worship. The Scrooby group settled at Leyden. The Gainsborough group found a home in Amsterdam. After 10 years in Holland, the Scrooby congregation, led by Pastor John Robinson, realized that their children were growing out of touch with their homeland, forgetting even their native tongue. But to return to England meant to return to the evil ways of English society. They had heard of the English colony in Virginia planted in 1607. Perhaps the new continent of America was their answer. It was a daring thought, full of unknown terrors, but a small number was willing to try. These returned to England, where they were joined by another group of like-minded pilgrims. In September 1620, a company of about 100 souls set sail from Plymouth in a ship called the Mayflower. In November, the crew sighted the rocky shore of New England. The Pilgrim Fathers stepped ashore at what we call Plymouth, Massachusetts. Meanwhile, the second group in Holland was on another pilgrimage. These separatists had been given aid by local Mennonites. We know little about their association, but we know they exchanged confessions to compare doctrines. The pastor of the separatists, a Cambridge graduate named John Smith, studied his Greek New Testament and discovered that the practice of baptizing babies never appeared in its pages. If babies were not included in the covenant of grace, only believers in Jesus Christ then shouldn't, If babies were not included in the covenant of grace, only believers in Jesus Christ, then shouldn't churches be constituted by confession of faith rather than ties of covenants. Smith and 40 members of the Amsterdam congregation answered yes and were baptized upon confession of their personal faith in Jesus Christ. Smith baptized himself by pouring water on himself and then baptized the other 40 members of his congregation. The year was 1609. Thus, they constituted the first English Baptist church. Okay, next, attack upon the Lord's anointed. Another section. Separation from the Church of England, however, was far too drastic for the vast majority of Puritans. They remained hopeful for some alternative to schism. All grounds for hope in the earthly rulers appeared to vanish in 1625. However, when Charles I followed his father James to the English throne, James had his theories about the divine right of kings. Charles was determined to put them into practice. No law and no parliament would restrain him. To make matters worse in the eyes of the Puritans, his wife Henrietta Maria was a French Roman Catholic princess. To enforce his will upon the Puritans, Charles found a ready servant in Archbishop William Laud, who believed that God had ordained bishops to govern his church. Led by the Archbishop, an Episcopal party arose to resist the Puritans. With the king's support, they reintroduced stained glass windows, crosses, even crucifixes. They elevated the communion table and called it an altar, and they insisted that worship be conducted according to the Book of Common Prayer and no other. Laud's high-minded and high-handed policy drove some Puritans towards separatism and others across the Atlantic to America. Within 10 years after Laud became Archbishop, 20 towns and churches had sprung up in Massachusetts Bay. In all 16,000 people, including the 400 who heard John Cotton's farewell at Southampton. That the spark that ignited open conflict came when Charles tried to force his high church brand of Anglican religion on the Presbyterian Scots. He insisted that they conduct their worship services from the Book of Common Prayer. John Milton called it the skeleton of a mass book. That is the way the Scots took it. They rose in opposition to move and joined in a national league of covenant. To defend their church, they dared to take up arms against their king. To put an army in the field, Charles was forced to convene Parliament, which he, like his father, had tried to ignore for over a decade. Once Parliament assembled, conflicting loyalties led to a royal party and a parliamentary party. The parliamentarians, clearly a majority, were agreed on the broad Puritan principles, but were divided over the form of the church. On the one hand were Presbyterians, on the other were Independents or Congregationalists. United in their hatred of Archbishop Laud, the parliamentarians succeeded in bringing him to trial and seeing him beheaded. Oh, wow. When Charles tried to punish the leaders of this opposition, civil war erupted. The royalist members of Parliament left London to join forces defending the king. So Parliament was free at last to institute the reform of the church the Puritans had always wanted. It called to Westminster scores of Puritan theologians and assigned to them the creation of a new form of worship and a new form of church government for the Church of England. The Westminster Assembly, meeting from 1643 to 1649, produced the Westminster Confession of Faith to replace the 39 Articles, as well as a larger and shorter catechism for use in the churches. These writings alone made the assembly one of the most significant gatherings of Christian history. Many Orthodox Presbyterians and Congregationalists use these documents to this day. And here we have a picture. It says, Assertion of the Liberty of Conscience by the Independents of Westminster Assembly of Divines by John Rogers Herbert, dated 1847. Here it is. In 1645, Parliament ordered the creation of presbyteries throughout the land and the election of elders for the churches. The system, however, was never fully enforced because Parliament never ruled the entire country, and even when the king was defeated, the army, not Parliament, wielded the power. Next, we have a section called The Rule of the Saints. The war itself brought forward one of the towering figures of Christian history, a country gentleman named Oliver Cromwell, 1599 to 1658. As a colonel in the parliamentary forces, he proved to be a military genius. His regiment, known as Ironsides, was never defeated, in part because Cromwell instilled in his soldiers a sense of discipline and Christian mission. The rise of Cromwell's star brought him in time to the leadership of the new model army. a force of 21,000 soldiers who considered their role in English history a call from God. In their eyes, the war was a Puritan crusade against the enemies of righteousness. The just then sanctified forces as a means. That is why the army prayed before battles and plunged into conflicts singing Christian hymns. By the end of 1646, Cromwell's army had forced Charles to surrender. For the next 2 years, the king tried to play his enemies against each other, the Scots, the Presbyterians who controlled Parliament, and the Independents who dominated the army. He succeeded in splitting Parliament and making a secret alliance with the Scots, but fierce resentment against Charles broke out in the army, and in 1648, war erupted anew. This time, the army defeated the allies of the king, and the Presbyterians were purged from the House of Commons. This so-called Rump Parliament, a tool of the army, created a high court of justice to try the king. In January 1649, Charles was led to the scaffold in front of the royal palace of Whitehall in London, and before an assembly throng, he was executed. It was a brash move, a sure sign of Puritanism's ultimate fall from power, for it gave the royalists their own martyr. Centuries of English royal tradition could not be erased, not even by the saints of God. Shortly after the king's execution, a portrait appeared, allegedly depicting his last hours. He was kneeling at a table. On it rested the Bible. The royal crown lay on the floor. In the king's right hand was a crown of thorns. His eyes were lifted to the crown of glory above. That's some propaganda. The widely distributed picture and its attendant sentiment unmasked Puritanism as no battlefield could. It changed Charles from a king executed by opponents of royalty into a martyr persecuted by fanatics. That is how many of the English chose to remember the Puritans. For the moment, however, the army of saints had their say. After abolishing the House of Lords, the House of Commons proclaimed England a republic. The Commonwealth. But in 1653, the army still distrusted Parliament, overthrew the Commonwealth, and set up a form of government called a protectorate. Cromwell held the office of Lord Protector, virtually a military dictator of England. The Lord Protector tried to achieve a religious settlement for the nation by granting liberty to a wide variety of Christian groups growing on the religious landscape: Presbyterians, Independents, Baptists, Quakers, Levelers, and others. Unfortunately, he found the task impossible, and the last 3 years of his life were filled with disappointment and trouble. When he died in 1658, the rule of the saints in Old England died with him. Within 2 years, the country welcomed the return of the monarchy, and with the king, the office of bishop. Far across the Atlantic, however, tens of thousands of saints were firmly settled in New England, where they were devoutly erecting the kingdom of God in the American wilderness. That is the end of chapter 31. Next will be chapter 32, Unwilling to Die for an Old Idea, Denominations.